Many animal species have died out on our watch. The mammoth and the dodo. The panda has been on the brink of extinction, but species like the northern white rhinoceros and the polar bear are probably less lucky. Extinct animals, when they are extinct, are lost forever. Or are they? What if we could bring them back? My name is Niels Chook. I'm an assistant curator at Studium Generale Utrecht. Since February, I've been an intern at Studium Generale, and part of my internship was investigating a project of de-extinction, the relatively novel science of bringing back extinct species. I wrote 5 short articles in a series about de-extinction, and due to that series, I recently got into contact with one of the faces of the science behind de-extinction, an American geneticist named Ben Novak. Ben is the leader of the Passenger Pigeon Project. The aim of that project is bringing back the extinct American bird, the passenger pigeon, which, he explains to me, for thousands of years had roamed the North American skies with colonies of millions, if not billions, until the Europeans colonized the Americas. Their appetite for hunting brought down the unique bird species, and it went extinct about 100 years ago. Well, I got to interview Ben, who has the air of a passionate visionary, and I talked with Ben about what de-extinction exactly means and what its purposes are in his eyes. We talk about his project. Where is the Passenger Pigeon Project now? And what are the technical challenges that he is facing for the future? At the end, Ben shares his vision for a better and greener world, which again has room for the passenger pigeon, and in which us, humans, have to live in closer harmony with nature. So, hi, Ben. Welcome.
Hello.
So, many people know what extinction is, but most people do. But you are studying the opposite, de-extinction. So, can I ask you, what exactly is it?
Well, de-extinction, it's really changed over the years, the concept, and I think it changes our views of extinction as well. And for anyone really wanting to delve into this, I have a published paper in the journal Genes, which is open science. It's simply titled De-extinction. It'll answer just about any questions anybody has. But the short answer is we are not reaching back into the past and resurrecting some long lost extinct species. We are using the DNA from an extinct species, the genome, the code, to understand more of that species and then transform its living relative into a surrogate or a replacement in the environment, something that can now take on the ecological role and fill its niche in nature. And so it's not about duplicating the past, it's about making something very functional for right now. And the past is our blueprint.
Right, and so some of these species, they are behind you on the poster. So for example, the mammoth, you're trying to recreate mammoth DNA, the other side, mammoth DNA out of what, and what is then the most related animal?
The most closely related species is the Asian elephant.
Right, and you take that as a blueprint and you shape it into, do you shape it fully into a mammoth? Do you get that far? Is that the idea?
It's really about tackling the problem. So, when you ask why bring back a mammoth, you have to ask, well, what is the problem that's trying to be solved? And the problem is actually related to climate change. So, and there's a few other problems that can be solved, which I'll get into and I'll go fast. But basically, Sergei Zimov is a scientist in Russia who for the last 30 years has been experimenting with converting tundra into grassland. Basically, all you need to do that is to bring in grazing species. So 10,000 years ago, it was a vast grassland called the Mammoth Steppe, which had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, despite climate going up and down, ice age, warming, melt, back and forth. This Mammoth Steppe existed, and it was stabilized and kept going by vast herds of grazing species. The mammoth plays a chief engineering role in that process that things like bison and horses and deer do not play because of its size and what it's capable of doing. And so the problem, of course, of climate change is imminent. We need high technology and lifestyle changes to confront this. But long term, we know that grassland was a stabilizing kind of buffer to major climate change, and that research coming out of Sergei Zimov's group, as well as independently verified by teams in Scandinavia and Canada, have shown that grassland sucks in more CO2, puts it into the permafrost, keeps the ground cooler, increases the albedo of the earth. It does a whole myriad of things that are good for climate. And so the idea is we want to convert tundra to grassland. And while we can do that by bringing in bison, horses, deer, and other grazers, the mammoth is that kind of big engineering component to that, which would complete an ecosystem. And so since that's what we want to do, really we need something capable of doing what the mammoth did. The Asian elephant is already 99.9% the same genetic animal as a mammoth anyway, but it's adapted in those tiny few genes of its genome that make the difference. It's adapted to living in the tropics. You can't just take it and put it in Siberia. So it's about creating a living elephant that can take on the role of a mammoth. So it has to be able to live in the cold, and that's where the wool comes in. That's where heavy amounts of insulating fat come in. Even changes to the sodium ion channels in the cell membranes and how hemoglobin binds oxygen, little bits like that.
The way the red blood cells carry oxygen through the body.
Exactly. And so, in truth, when your problem is converting grassland, we want a large elephant engineer. It's not about editing the Asian elephant genome with 1 million mammoth mutations, most of which make no difference at all, but accumulated through time. It's about selecting those traits that actually will let that species thrive and live and do its job in Siberia.
Right. And how do you know the difference between a mammoth and an elephant?
Well, that all comes down to sequencing their genomes. There are going to be some differences.
Finding out the code of their DNA.
Yeah. There will be some differences that we may never actually be able to investigate, things like differences in methylation and epigenetics. But, the really hard part of the DNA code that makes them different is something we can directly compare, because starting back in 1984, people started being able to actually get DNA out of old specimens and sequence it. And thanks to next generation sequencing, we can actually do that really well now. And mammoth DNA is in good shape, relatively speaking. All ancient DNA is in bad shape. But because there's lots of specimens, I keep forgetting he's over there, lots of specimens preserved in permafrost, it's been kept really well for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, and so you can kind of assemble the DNA back from these tiny parts of ancient DNA that you can get from the fossils.
Precisely.
Right. And you yourself, you are not, you haven't studied the mammoth. You have been studying a different animal, the passenger pigeon.
Yeah, the one I keep wanting to point to over here.
Yeah, so that's an extinct bird from North America. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, and what I know is the following: the passenger pigeon once was the most abundant bird in the world, and it flew in flocks of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, over North America. And in the 18th and 19th century, people were hunting the passenger pigeon, and quite rapidly disappeared completely. And I think the last female is a bird named Martha. She died in 1917, so a little bit over 100 years ago. So let's talk about the passenger pigeon now. First, as a species, in your eyes, what makes it such a beautiful animal?
Well, people are very familiar with the common street pigeon, native to the Mediterranean and Europe, which was domesticated thousands of years ago. And really there's a lot of beauty in that bird. There's a lot of variation in that bird. There's a reason Darwin studied it. But people are very unfamiliar with the fact that there are hundreds of wild species of pigeon. There's actually more than 350 wild species of pigeon. They're one of the most diverse groups of birds in the world. They live on every island and continent, except for the Arctic regions. Some of them are lime green with pink heads, and some are bright orange. And there's this immense diversity. But the passenger pigeon was truly unique among all pigeons. But what truly made them so unique was, you commented about the size of their flocks, and you were off by just an order of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
Their flocks were in the range of hundreds of millions to
Really?
billion.
Wow.
Um, and it's they're they were likened to a storm. When they would fly by, it was like thunder. I mean, that their wings would create wind.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the when you read the accounts about them, their sheer numbers is something that's hard to believe. But what's truly unique about that is you could have a billion rock pigeons or a billion band-tailed pigeons or a billion mourning doves, and they would never be the same phenomenon as a billion passenger pigeons, because unlike all those other species of pigeons who might be social when they migrate or social at one point in the year, they they were social and densely social all year long, 100% of the time. And when
Mm-hmm.
they would breed in colonies like seabirds, and that's unique among all pigeons. There's no other pigeon that breeds in that type of colony setting.
We mentioned that for the mammoth, there is a function in resurrecting the mammoth or bringing back a mammoth look-alike, which is for the purpose of uh, averting climate change. What would be the main purpose of bringing back the passenger pigeon?
It's all about forestry management. So in the past nearly 100 years now, forests in the United States have been regenerating. And this is hugely economic. Agriculture has shifted to the Midwest and the Great Plains. Many mines and other uses of the land have been exhausted and shifted to the West. And so the East United States, which was greatly developed up until the 1920s, started patches of land started being abandoned and not used anymore, and so they reforested. you
Mm-hmm.
know um, and there's actually as much forest cover today in places like New England and the southern United States as there was in the 1700s, in most places like it was in the 1850s or 60s. So there's a lot of good habitat. The crazy phenomenon happening that kind of jars people's ideas about ecology and conservation is something conservationists have recognized for a long time, is it's not just about having the habitat, it's about having the dynamics of the habitat moving. And so there's a lot of forest, but there's no turnover and no regeneration, which is causing certain types of trees to become more dominant than others.
Mm-hmm.
And the more shift you have in dominance of one type of species over another, the fewer species ultimately start living in the ecosystem. It shifts towards a certain set really thriving. And that's what we're seeing happening in the Eastern United States, is that all this biodiversity that once lived there is really getting thinned out and becoming just one type of habitat and one type of system dominating everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So you would
Um,
say it's a mature forest, but in that way it's very much the same everywhere, and that's from one meter to the next, and that's not good for the biodiversity.
exactly. The terms that are used, of course, are homogeneous and heterogeneous, and it's becoming a much more homogeneous environment. When heterogeneous environments, of course, support more diversity. It's
Mm-hmm.
built into the name. And the neat thing about forest regeneration is that rather than creating a patchwork or mosaic of ecosystems spatially, it also creates one temporally. So a patch of forest can be hit hard by a disturbance, and over the course of several years, regenerate back to a mature stand of forest, and
Mm-hmm.
then be hit with another disturbance again. And so through time, it's actually 5 or 6 or 7 different habitat types. And when you do that all over the place, at any given time, you've got those 7 habitat types in a large space, and it's always changing where they're at through time as well. And that's really an incredible dynamic that most species in the Eastern United States and many species throughout the world have actually adapted to live in and become dependent upon. And it's those species that have become entirely dependent on that regeneration that, of course, are the ones first to die off when that regeneration is no longer happening.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're seeing in the Eastern United States on local scales. And eventually it will be throughout the entire United States, where many of these species that are dependent on disturbances will become either extinct in the Eastern United States or completely dependent on conservationists, the people who go out and create these disturbances. And for decades, it was thought that fire was the real driver of that engineering in the environment.
That was the disturbance that caused
that was, yeah,
eventually biodiversity.
Yeah, so they thought forestry managers really felt, that it was fire, and there's been debate over wildfires versus the First Nations people driving fires. But something they never really thought about was the impact of these pigeons, and a big interplay with them in the environment. And they were a constant source of this regeneration cycle for a long time.
Because they were with millions,
yeah.
And the size of that flock completely disturbed the patch of forest.
Yes. And that's basically the dynamic we want to reestablish for a couple of purposes. One, of course, to reinitiate those regeneration cycles, to conserve that biodiversity, to prevent more species from becoming endangered, but also because a wild species can do this job much better than we can as people. There are people out there going out, chopping down branches or starting controlled birds, doing different types of mechanical work to create these disturbances. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of manpower. You can't cover a huge space very well with it. And, in a century, or even sooner than that, we could have flocks of pigeons out there doing the job for us at bigger scale, more effectively, in a way that's co-evolved with the species that still live there. And, in my mind, the beauty of it is there's a lot more layers to how that can benefit the world, not just in the conservation of these species, but also in the fact that regenerating forests, similar to the climate change benefit of mammoths, regenerating forests create more photosynthetic processing, so that increases carbon cycling.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of great, exciting economic opportunities, from ecotourism to agricultural. But ultimately, there's that conservation need of, we have a forest, it's becoming a mature stand of forest that's more homogeneous, there's fewer species able to thrive in it. And if we get that heterogeneous mosaic back, then we can have all of these amazing species that we've come to know and love in the Eastern US really thrive again, and know that they're not going to go extinct anytime soon.
Right. And then the passenger pigeon could be a key player in initiating this renewal, the renewal of this entire process.
Oh, it would be the entire player, ultimately. Right. Humans could eventually take an entire step back and not be as involved.
And so let's take a step back, the both of us, and talk about the how, the what and the how of this whole project. Let's talk about the part of the project that is behind you first. So you talked about you need ancient DNA that you need to gather from fossils or from some kind of what's left over from the extinct bird, and that requires comparison with a still living species. And you take a living species that's close to the passenger pigeon. So do you take a rock pigeon, a normal pigeon that we have in the cities here, or what kind of species do you take?
The closest living relative of the passenger pigeon is the band-tailed pigeon. It's another North American species. It's basically the West Coast version of a passenger pigeon. So it's nearly the same species, but as I said, the passenger pigeon was wholly unique in the way it bred colonially and the way it was always hyper social. So band-tailed pigeons don't do that, so they wouldn't create the same impact in the environment, which they don't.
Because they have much smaller flocks and not year-round.
Exactly. So what we've done to date is sequence the genome of the band-tailed pigeon, and it used that to then sequence and map the DNA of the passenger pigeon.
So now, so you know the genomes, which is the whole DNA code of the extinct bird, the passenger pigeon, and its closest living relative, called the band-tailed pigeon. Does that mean that you know what to change in the DNA code? Does it mean that you know which genes you need to edit to change a band-tailed pigeon into a passenger pigeon?
It's to date, we actually have not investigated what genes create a passenger pigeon or not. We know that there are so many mutations that are different between the two genomes. We do have that idea of some genes that were under selection, but we don't yet know what would be the genes that we would edit to recreate the passenger pigeon. And that's the goal that we want. Now that we have both genomes, we want to be able to line them up side by side and start looking at how do you create the blue color, the red breast, the long tail. And the only reason we care about those physical traits is those are traits that are actually linked to social behavior. The fact that the male has a red breast and the female does not indicates that they had social social breeding behaviors for the males competing for the females, which is more intense in a gregarious species. The tail being elongated the way it was also related to that type of display. We know that they developed faster as chicks than their related species. About half the time they grew in about half the time. And we know that that's going to be very important, that if you're living in a giant flock, growing with fewer resources is important, because you can exhaust resources relatively quickly in a giant population. But the main thing is the behavior. And those are genes that for any species, we still don't really have any solid science behind. We know that there are some genes, like genes involved in, regulating serotonin, oxytocin, other things that impact behavior, but we don't know that, but we do not know the entire gene pathways involved in those systems, and we don't know the genetics of neurobiology very well yet. We know the genetics involved in pigment and some other things like growth. We don't know those other genes yet. So there's a lot of discovery that has to happen, but we have sequenced those genomes. We've started studying its ecology. We have a much more clear picture of how we would, want to proceed putting it back in the wild. We've also studied living band-tailed pigeons and how they breed in captivity. So that's the key thing about what's behind us and what's in front of us, is that this is not just about studying DNA and making edits in a genome. A conservation project is about breeding animals in captivity, releasing them to the wild, monitoring them in the wild. It's hugely interdisciplinary, and there's a lot of social facets to it as well. So we've had several publications come out, but basically I like to say that at this point, in 8 years of running the project with our various amazing partners that have all put in their work in kind and almost on shoestring budgets, we have the bookends of passenger pigeon de-extinction. We have the tools we need. We have the genomes. We know we know how to breed band-tailed pigeons in captivity. We know how to manipulate their breeding cycles. We know a lot about the role we want passenger pigeons to play in the environment, some of the designs and how we would actually foster them and breed them, and reproduce them to put into the wild. We've also, through a couple of years of research in Australia that I was conducting, figured out how we handle the eggs, how we would open them up to actually manipulate the embryos to create the gene-edited birds and hatch and raise those to adulthood. So we have a lot of the mechanics figured out, but there's two big parts of the project that are still on the table and on the drawing board.
The holes in the blueprint. You have almost the whole blueprint established, and there's a couple of empty areas.
Yeah, the big empty areas are actually starting to figure out what are those genes that create those traits, selecting which are the candidates, being able to actually test those first, and then, of course, being able to actually generate embryos from cell lines.
Okay, so if you will, let's go into that a bit deeper. The gene editing happens in cell lines, cells in petri dishes in the laboratory. And then a difficult technical step is required to grow out these cells into embryos, into a fetus, into a little bird. So what is it exactly that you're doing, and what's the difficult part?
The technology for taking a cell and engineering it or editing it and then creating an embryo for a mouse or a cow would be cloning, or doing single cell in vitro fertilization and doing it at the single cell stage.
Yeah.
Those are things that are not really plausible with birds because of the way they reproduce and the way they form the egg shell around their embryo and lay their egg. And so the workaround that through studying the biology of birds that people came up with is something called germline transmission. And it's a lot like human in vitro fertilization, but if you were to take it and take some of the steps one level up. So in human in vitro fertilization, you have a donor father and a donor mother. You get the egg cell and the sperm. You create the embryo in vitro, then implant it.
Which means in the laboratory. That's what in vitro
in the
means, right?
laboratory. Yep. And then you implant it into a surrogate mother. Now imagine if you took donor sperm from a donor dad, donor eggs from a donor mom, and instead of putting them together in the lab and creating the embryo in a petri dish and then putting into a mother, you took that donor sperm, put it into a surrogate father, the donor eggs into a surrogate mother, and then let them breed to produce the baby.
Right.
That's what we can do with birds, is we take the donor germ cells from each parent, put them into surrogates, and then let them breed. And it's when you take them from each parent, that's when you can grow them in the laboratory. So you can do your gene editing or whatever you're doing when they're growing in the laboratory, then implant them in the parents. And basically that's because it's so hard to grow bird embryos in vitro that we do that, we go one step above and it brings in a surrogate dad rather than just a surrogate mom.
Yeah, so you would have a DNA edited germline from the father, so the sperm cell, and from the mother, the same, also gene edited. And they are
gene
both
edited.
Gene edited band-tail pigeon. And you put them in band-tail pigeon, a mom and a father, and you let them breed, and out comes an egg, and inside that egg would be the passenger pigeon.
A new passenger pigeon, precisely. And that process of germline transmission, the mechanics of it, taking the cells out, implanting them, that's not so difficult. It's getting those cells to live in the laboratory that's difficult.
Right. They die when they are in the petri dish.
Exactly.
So, if I can summarize, there are two main technical challenges. One, you have to find out and test which genes made the passenger pigeon so unique, acting in such large social groups year-round. And two, you have to find a way to get the embryos to stay alive in the laboratory. But what if all the challenges are met? What if this project succeeds? What kind of a world do you see before you? Do you see the North American skies filled up with millions of passenger pigeons again? Is that the ultimate goal?
I think it's my vision is much bigger. It's more intricate. It's if I were to really share what the vision I see for the future, it's a future of sustainability, in which people are using land differently. People are have a different relationship with nature. I want everyone, no matter who they are, where they're from, rural, urban, whatever race, creed, or religion, whatnot, to be able to feel as if humans are not separate from nature, but that we are, part of it. And we don't just go there to immerse ourselves in a national park when we want to get away, but that biodiversity is just an intrinsic part of the human experience. By appreciating the species in our city parks, in our backyards, the fact that there are invertebrates and microbes living in our apartments, and that the world is this biological wonder around us. And for me, the passenger pigeon species like mammoths, elephants, megafauna, and these greatly abundant species. There's something that draws us to those. People were tweeting about these 10,000 green sea turtles amassing at the Great Barrier Reef, and when big accumulations of species happen, they're so rare now that it's something almost abnormal for us to see. And that used to be the entire world all the time. So I think it's not just about getting a flock of 10 million passenger pigeons out, up to maybe a few hundred million, a billion passenger pigeons out there being this biological storm that is this eighth wonder of the world for people to enjoy, doing something amazing, creating not only ecotourism but hunting opportunities, and I view the guano on the ground as being something people can harvest for organic agriculture, the felled limbs that artisanal woodworkers can use for different types of lumber and art. I see so many different social aspects and differences in culture around the idea of getting something like that back into the world, but I see it as one little piece of a huge world in which we actually embrace and foster the abundance of all life everywhere.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thanks for sharing your far-reaching vision and your answers. If people want to reach you or find your organization, Revive and Restore, what can they do?
So Revive and Restore is a nonprofit organization. We get approached a lot by people wondering how they can help. And quite honestly, the best way anyone can help is by donating. As a nonprofit, we run completely off of donations. So if projects like mammoths and passenger pigeons really excite you, you can donate specifically to those projects. If you're not into de-extinction, but you are very, very, very keen on restoring coral reefs or helping the horseshoe crab or the black-footed ferret over here, we have a diversity of projects that anyone could get behind and support. And we're funding a lot more projects now thanks to donations, but we always need more. Every donation helps. Even small donations cover a huge amount of work for conservation.